Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming. My name is Kat and I'm the proprietor of the room you're seated in tonight, the Athenaeum. We are a brick and mortar psychedelic community center and we are membership supported, so if any of you have any questions about the space or what we do, please come up to me and ask at any point in time. So tonight we're really thrilled to host Lucid News and a panel on the future of psychedelic research. So I'm going to introduce Ken Jordan, who will be our moderator tonight.
Thank you very much, Ken. And thank you all for coming out. Happy August in New York. You're still here. That's an impressive achievement in and of itself. As are our three speakers tonight. We are here to discuss the forward edge of psychedelic research. And I think we're going to find that there's way more going on that's fascinating and engaging than we're going to be able to cover in the 4.5 hours we have ahead of us tonight, or however long we actually end up going. But before we do dive in, I'd just like to mention that our site, Lucid News, we cover what's happening in the psychedelic space. We're at lucid.news on the internets, and we have recently launched the beta of a second website, which we call Psychedelic U, the letter U, like university, which is now, I would say it's more than a prototype, but it's less than a fully completed project, but we're hoping to provide the kind of introductory level information about psychedelics that many people are looking to find in the kind of authoritative and informed voice, while linking out to the best resources that are online that are being provided by the many other websites and resources that are out there doing great work. And this is all vetted links, so we're only linking to things that the folks who are working in our space are verifying and feeling, okay, this is something you can link to that's authoritative. So if you get a chance, please check it out, psychedelic letter U.net, N-E-T, and let us know what you think. So we shall now, without further ado, launch into our discussion. We have three distinguished panelists, and I will read brief biographies so you can have an idea who they are and what they bring to this conversation. To my immediate left is Jonathan Sporn. He's the founder and CEO of Gilgamesh Pharmaceuticals. He has 25 years plus of experience in drug development, including at Pfizer and J&J. He's been an assistant professor of psychiatry at Columbia University and was the founder of Perception Neurosciences, acquired by Atai Life Sciences. To his immediate left is Priscilla Duggan. Duggan.
Yeah.
I should have checked that before we got up.
Potatoes, potatoes.
Everyone says it wrong, it's fine.
Priscilla recently graduated from Barnard College with a degree in cognitive and behavioral neuroscience. During her 4 years as an undergraduate, she worked at the SAMES lab at Columbia University, investigating the therapeutic efficacy of novel psychedelics. Shamish. There's no H in this. It doesn't say Shamish, it says SAMES, actually. Samis? Samish lab at Columbia University, investigating the therapeutic efficacy of novel psychedelic compounds and selective serotogenetic targeting in preclinical models, for which she was recently awarded the Capstone Prize for Distinguished Achievement in Neuroscience. And at the far left is Elias Dakwar, who has completed a fellowship in addiction psychiatry at Columbia and received the K23 award evaluating the ketamine infusions combined with mindfulness training to treat cocaine use disorders. Most recently, he is a principal investigator on several RO1s, evaluating ketamine for induction onto the extended release oh my God. See, now this is going to be a very interesting conversation. You can tell right now because I really...
It's Elias.
I'm sorry?
So
Yeah, well, that part I usually get kind of right, but when it comes to certain technical terms, I'm totally lost. But you're going to explain all of this to us in a way that this will not be an issue. For opioid use disorder, as well as ketamine infusion to facilitate treatment of cocaine use disorder and alcohol use disorder. So as you can tell, I'm a liberal arts guy, and I come to psychedelics through a very different door than the medical scientific research side, but I am absolutely fascinated by it and understand that the future of psychedelic use and culture is drawing tremendously on what's being discovered in the medical research realm. So I wanted to have this conversation with these folks so I can learn a few things that I need to know. But one big question that I think would maybe kick this off, and I mentioned to a couple of you that I was going to ask this, is as someone who has spent many years as an old person using very familiar psychedelics, I wonder if you could explain to us perhaps the reason for making new compounds or variations of the old compounds. What is the driving force behind that, and why is it even necessary? Couldn't we somehow simply use the ones that have hundreds or thousands of years of practice associated with them in a medical context rather than having to create new ones? Who would like to start by addressing that question? Jonathan.
It's a complicated question. So, I mean, maybe one thing to say would be that the molecules that are in the world, for many years, were, let's say as an example, psilocybin. That was not something obviously that was designed for say treating mental illness. If we're sort of thinking about that as part of the research endeavor is to target some forms of psychopathology. So the question then becomes, just as an example, as effective and useful as that molecule certainly is, can we make or develop other molecules that have the same pharmacologic target, that essentially are hitting the same receptors that trigger the kinds of therapeutic and experiences and psychedelic experiences, and those may be separable or not. But you can do that if you can look at the properties of psilocybin, for example. You may be able to make molecules that have properties that have some benefit in certain circumstances. So, for example, it may be that if we're talking about psilocybin or LSD, that they have a very long, fairly long activity. So if you're going to your doctor's office, having to be there for 6 hours or 8 hours or something like that, may be problematic for societally for being able to make that broadly available. So it could be that a molecule that has therapeutic efficacy but only lasts a couple hours or something like that may be an example of where innovation can occur. But there's also, at a more cynical level, there's also the issue of intellectual property with molecules that is also helpful when you're trying to get very large sums of money that are required to do the sort of average of 1,500 patients that are needed to be exposed for safety, and whatever number are needed for efficacy. and and then to commercialize these drugs, which is also extremely expensive. So having intellectual property on molecules also helps, because it means that a company like Johnson & Johnson or AbbVie or some of the majors are willing to potentially step in that sense. So I think that's a good at least starting point, and maybe I can hand this off to somebody else for comment.
Yeah, I will also say, just speaking to the research side of this, because as my 4 years as an undergraduate, this is a lot of the work I did was in a lab where we made a lot of different analogs of certain classical types of psychedelics, and organic chemistry in itself is such a powerful tool that can help elucidate, for example, mechanism, which is something that people are really looking into in the research field right now, or structure-activity relationships. So like Jonathan was talking about, what happens when you change one substituent group on some classical psychedelic like mescaline to another group, and how can that help like build a profile of the compound and characterize a compound, and maybe eliminate certain unwanted symptoms or unwanted characterizations of that molecule. For example, with many classical psychedelics, they are selective for the 5-HT2B receptor, which is a receptor on the heart, and has been implicated in valvular heart disease. So that would be something that ideally you would want to eliminate in designing a drug. So yeah, it can be really helpful, and yeah.
You got your own mic.
Oh.
Yeah. You can take it off and maybe just.
Well, the subtext in all of this is that we're trying to make these substances more tractable, putting them to a use that is more consistent with how we see medicine. And something I heard a while ago came to mind as we were talking about this. A friend who was contemplating, the place of these different substances in our lives, said, imagine a UFO landed in a field, and we poke around and we realize, if we hitch some horses to this, it's going to really plow the fields pretty well. So we go ahead and we start using the UFO in ways that are consistent with plowing the field, but we realize, there's some things that need to be shaved off, and so it could maybe be more efficient. And of course, the question that goes unanswered is, why is the UFO here in the first place? I'm not saying that these compounds are extraterrestrial, missionaries or anything, but they are undoubtedly disclosing something mysterious about ourselves, about our relationships with one another and with them as well. And so I think we do need to be thoughtful in the rush to put these medicines into the field and have them do the work that we're used to having medicines doing. Being thoughtful about, well, what else might be possible, and what are we missing by moving too quickly to these utilitarian aims. Now, what didn't go mentioned, I think it is important, that a lot of these substances have, difficult effects. They can, Ibogaine, for example, can cause cardiotoxic effects, and so it's important. We want to have Ibogaine be used more widely, that we figure out a way to manage those cardiotoxic effects. Ketamine has urotoxic effects. Are there ways to work with ketamine that manages those problems? Science can be kind of put to use in a way that allows us to reap the benefits in a way that doesn't expose us to unnecessary risk, but having too clear a notion of what the benefit is can be blinding, I think. So, yeah, leave it there.
So actually, I'd like to pick up on that, because I'm wondering, Jonathan, if, I mean, what I heard you say, I think effectively, was that there is a medical model that we have for medicines, for pharmaceutical products, that is well established, is expensive to pursue, to get FDA approval, can cost, the numbers I hear, like $300 million to get a pharmaceutical through the entire process all the way to commercialization. And so, how do you, the question would be like, how do you look at psychedelics and adapt them to work more effectively within that model, so you can, let's say, target an outcome, that is to say, let's say we want to address alcoholism or anxiety or some kind of mental or physical issue that it seems that psychedelics in some way have been successful, at least anecdotally, in addressing, and then tweak the molecules to make them even better at that one thing, that outcome. Am I kind of paraphrasing you properly? Is that closer to where you were coming from?
Well, I mean, generally the concept, and
Then use them.
so yeah, I mean the concept is more or less that you're looking at both efficacy and safety are the two are the critical variables, and of course we're talking about these things from the point of view of sort of the 20th century, 21st century sort of approaches to, as you said, sort of a scientific kind of drug development perspective, but that's of course different than what Elias was talking about, which is also a long tradition of people either in indigenous cultures or in the more in the Western world, exploring these compounds for self-exploration and self-observation, and for becoming more. Let's think this. Sorry, that's fine. And so I think that those are very different. Those are very different kinds of endeavors, and both of them are interesting and not mutually exclusive. And in fact, I mean, one of the things to think about even in the drug discovery development world is how important it is for the people who are doing that science to have not be just taking other people's word for it, but actually having direct experience and understanding of these molecules. I think it helps a lot in terms of even just generating ideas of where they would be effective. But I mean, just to the other example that Elias gave around, say, ibogaine, one of the things that we've done within the Gilgamesh world is to take that ibogaine molecule, and Priscilla's been in the Samish lab where a lot of this stuff was done, and to modify that molecule, and then to some degree serendipitously find that as an example, the cardiac toxicity was actually eliminated from some of the analogs that were made, which with ibogaine, that cardiac toxicity can be managed for most people, but there have been numerous deaths due to ibogaine. So and so as these things, we know from lots of examples in neuroscience and elsewhere, when drugs get out into the market or out into the world and start to be used by very large numbers of people, things happen that you don't see, or you don't experience when you're looking at small numbers of individuals. So it becomes when it's 100,000 people, you see stuff you don't see when it's 1,000 people, and those things can be serious. So I think that's an example where the scientific approach to this can take some of in that case a safety risk out, but we also don't know in this case yet with our ibogaine analogs, will they be exactly have the same efficacy profile as ibogaine itself, because as you change one atom at a time, some of the pharmacology morphs, and so it's not exactly the same thing. So I think that's an example. I think the other is that as much as in sort of the bubble of sort of the psychedelic communities or the kind of worlds we live in, it seems that having a psychedelic trip is something that's easily sort of managed and experienced by people. But when you start to look at the larger world, if you could have these compounds, if you could create compounds where people have neuroplastic effects and psychologically important positive effects, but where they don't necessarily have to have a psychedelic trip, where that sort of blinding sort of mystical experience or insight may not actually occur at all, but people still feel significantly better. That has dramatic implications for the broader therapeutic experience for people.
You just opened up a lot of interesting doors for us to walk through. I'm going to maybe focus first on the last one. And I'm pulling my chair up so I can actually see everybody better. There has been interesting research recently that as I understand it, around how analyzing how the mechanisms of action of psychedelic compounds to maybe separate the neuroplastic type effects from what some people describe as the hallucinogenic or the journey trip effects, and that these could be addressed by changing molecules. You can actually just focus perhaps on the neuroplastic or psychological benefits without the journey. That within the psychedelic community obviously has triggered a lot of people to feel like, well, that's somehow sacrilegious. You shouldn't strip the trip from the experience. But there's also, as you were saying, much to be said about, well, if there are benefits, true benefits for people without the trip, shouldn't that also be pursued and understood? I'm wondering if just maybe one of you could address quickly the science, the research there about separating these two elements from the single psychedelic compound. Let's start with that, and then you guys got to compete over who's going to say it, because I'm sure you both know it.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to the science, because this is something we addressed in my former lab in the most recent paper we published, which was on a compound of Alexander Shulgin's called Ariadne, which is a phenethylamine compound. And when Shulgin bioassayed this compound in the 70s, he reported really interesting effects, which was almost negligible psychedelic subjective activity.
Can I just quickly ask, who here knows who Alex Shulgin is? And who doesn't? I think we should do a quickie.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So Alexander Shulgin was kind of a titan within the psychedelic research community, has since passed, but was a very skilled organic chemist and dedicated his life's work to synthesizing hundreds of novel psychedelic compounds, so something that we were discussing a few minutes ago. And his wife, Anne Shulgin, was a really skilled therapist and they wrote 2 books together named PCAL and TCAL, which are acronyms that stand for phenethylamines I've known and loved, and tryptamines I've known and loved. And they both bioassayed all these compounds together, so took them, and wrote about their experiences. And he's a fantastic scientist. I recommend that everyone reads those books because they're not only for scientists, they're really entertaining. But regardless, so one of these hundreds of compounds he made that he named Ariadne, he noted these interesting effects, which was a lack of subjective psychedelic effects, but this elevation in his mood, so he notes that it could be a useful antidepressant. And a few years later, the pharmaceutical house Bristol Myers bought it, acquired it, and started giving it to its patients, and not only reported elevated mood, but pretty remarkable effects in treating neurodegenerative diseases, so in Parkinson's disease patients and senile geriatric patients. So we wanted to look into whether this was true and whether we could reprove it in preclinical models with mice. And what was specifically provocative about this molecule was this lack of supposed psychedelic effects. And that's been a big question in the research community, is whether the two are separable. I am not sure how I feel about approaching that, but I will say it depends on, I think, what you're treating and what you're thinking about treating. Because, for example, with something like Ariadne, if you're treating Parkinson's disease, maybe you don't need a psychedelic experience.
Well, so my question about Ariadne is, if it doesn't produce a trip, why is it psychedelic?
That's something.
I mean, why are you describing it as psychedelic?
Because structurally, it's almost exactly the same to mescaline, and a close cousin of it is named Dom. That's only 1 carbon group away, and an incredibly potent psychedelic. So that's one of the questions that we were trying to answer in this paper, is why is it such a low threshold psychedelic if it's so similar to these very powerful psychedelics? And it selectively interacts with the serotonin receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor, activity of which has been attributable to the psychedelic experience. So that's something new. But so much of drug discovery has been led by this sort of serendipitous discovery followed by systematic research. So, I'm not against that line of inquiry and curiosity, because I think that's foundational to the scientific process, but I think it's important to stay cautious about the kind of questions that you're asking.
Yeah, and the terminology is such that, it's just a matter of understanding what people are saying. In this case, it's that these are drugs that are hitting the same drug target as psychedelic drugs hit, but
drug
are
target in the brain? Like
like the same receptor system in the brain, and yet and there are other examples of this, that of molecules that are doing that, but don't have that kind of so they're psychoactive, might be a way to put it. So you feel them, but they're not causing the sort of classic psychedelic trip. And what's kind of interesting is that we're starting now to understand tentatively now why this is. So the neurobiology of this is starting to kind of come into some focus, and one piece of this is that when a drug, when one of these 5-HT2A agonists, as they're called, these serotonin subtype agonists, bind to that receptor, there are 2 different signaling systems involved. One is called GQ, or G protein coupled receptor signaling, and the other is a arrestin signaling system. So it's as if the drug is hitting a lock, and there's 2 different downstream processes that are triggered by the drug hitting that receptor, or fitting into that lock. And what is now becoming clearer, in fact, this is so new that it's literally, it's not new within my company because there's a lot of sort of proprietary information, but now it's very new in terms of it being a public information about this, and to the extent that literally this was just reported out in the last 48 hours. And what's been found is that if you take these phenylethylamines that Priscilla was talking about, and you examine the way that you can morph those molecules, and you can make them so that some of them are hitting one of these what are called second messenger systems, this G protein coupled system, and some of them are more hitting this arrestin. And so to the extent that the maximum efficacy is above some threshold, you get a psychedelic effect. And if it's below that, in terms of this G protein signaling, you don't get a psychedelic effect. And but the arrestin signaling seems to be sufficient, at least in our hands, to cause antidepressant effects, at least in animal models.
But then there are some drugs like ibogaine that are very potent psychedelics subjectively that actually don't have any appreciable activity at
That's
the
right.
receptor, which is just a total mystery.
Yeah, and it's a very different, as I understand it, it's a very different kind of psychedelic experience, and it's a different phenomenology with something like ibogaine, because ibogaine is an atypical psychedelic. Yeah. So, but the point of it just is that we're starting to sort of decipher the science involved here so that we can understand how to separate those two things. And it doesn't mean that one or the other is a better way to go. It's likely that both would be useful. And you can imagine, even for someone who's, that having a psychedelic trip and having this experience of insight and may be very rich and rewarding and therapeutic, but it may be that person then, on an ongoing basis, might need some a drug that targets that same receptor once a week or once a month or what have you. You wouldn't want to probably have a intense psychedelic trip every week. That would be a bit much, at least for me. So I think that's an example where it could be, just as an example, where the induction of therapeutic response could be with the psychedelic trip, and the maintenance therapeutics may be looked at as potentially without that. So I think there's a lot of optionalities here, but this is just an example of, to your starting question of why make new molecules. This is where, we don't know, as we're doing all this stuff, we don't know where it'll turn out. That's kind of the fun of it too.
Elias, I'm wondering if you've been tracking some of the research around the psychedelic visionary experience, as we're understanding more about how these compounds are working on the brain or on the body, and what has seemed particularly interesting to you or illuminating to you in some of the research that's been coming out.
Well, we should begin by accepting that there are substances that are non-psychoactive in the ways that we experience psychedelics that are helpful for all kinds of mood and anxiety issues. And so it's not a paradigm shift to be emphasizing that those substances do exist and they are helpful. And we may be able to elaborate such substances from existing so-called psychedelics. I think what may be a cause for some concern, and I can talk about what I've seen happen over the course of my work with ketamine, for example. What is a cause for concern is that psychiatry, as a discipline, mainstream medicine more generally, have regarded non-ordinary experiences as pathological, as problematic. And there's been a prejudice against them. and not simply experiences that emerge due to psychoactive substance use, but that occur spontaneously, that occur when people are in distress and working things through in an idiosyncratic way. And so we...
Some of the earliest scientific research into psychedelics was addressing them as essentially a way to create psychosis, psychomimetic, exactly,
Yeah.
to replicate a psychotic experience, because they didn't understand it or perceive it as a visionary experience in the way that some people, other people have
Right.
had understood it.
So we are still contending with this prejudice in psychiatry. And with ketamine, for example, as it was emerging as an antidepressant, there was a lot of, this is 20 years ago, there was a lot of interest in developing a ketamine-like compound that targeted the same, quote, receptors, that had the same, quote, mechanisms of action. This is all on a fairly neural level, while doing away with these behaviorally toxic effects. That's how the psychoactive effects of ketamine were construed. And I think Jonathan was also interested in this kind of question at one point, to speak more to it with our ketamine, etc. But there was a lot of interest in developing compounds that don't do what ketamine does psychoactively, but that may provide the same benefits.
And of course, ketamine itself was developed as a substitute for PCP or angel dust, which has also the same mechanism of action, but has even more psychotomimetic-like effects, and is more problematic. So they were trying to and Ed Domino, who was early in the clinical development of ketamine, was when he heard I guess it was Park Davis came to him with ketamine. He was like, he had worked on PCP before that, and they were like, oh, and he was like, oh no, not another molecule like that. And they had to convince him that it was worth studying. But I think to Elias's point too, if you look at the drug label for Spravato, which is S-ketamine, which is approved by Johnson and is an approved drug marketed by Johnson & Johnson for treatment-resistant depression. If you look at the adverse events, it's one of them is being very happy.
Maybe just to explain enantiomers, what R and S ketamine. Well, regardless, just to digress for a second, the R and S ketamine are basically mirror images of each other. It's a chemistry term called enantiomer. So when you see something that's called R ketamine or S ketamine, it's one half of what would be called a racemic mixture, which would just be ketamine.
Mirror images.
But just to finish this point about ketamine.
Yeah.
So we saw this prejudice working to, first of all, lead ketamine to be hitched to horses to plow the field in ways that we understand. But also putting patients into some jeopardy because there wasn't the kind of sensitivity to the psychoactive effects that there could have been. So, for example, in a lot of the early ketamine research, people were basically plugged to IVs, left alone, not given any kind of therapeutic support during the experience beforehand or afterwards. And the incidence of difficult dissociation was present. I would also say that there was a missed opportunity. The research I've done has suggested that those psychoactive effects could be helpful, could be utilized, and of course now it's kind of common knowledge that ketamine does interesting things that are comparable to psychedelics, and we can utilize. I mean, not that this is revolutionary science, but it's an example of how we are often as scientists, caught up in our schemes to such an extent that we miss opportunities for rethinking how we might do things. And I'm not saying that we should, pigeonhole ourselves to a psychedelic model and remain there, but there, some greater perspective on what's happening should remain for all of us as we're approaching these substances.
I think you're raising an interesting question that sort of comes back to the thing I was asking about before, which is if we're operating with the understanding that the existing medical model, FDA approval, psychiatry as it more or less exists today, is the framework into which we are introducing psychedelic compounds, new medications perhaps that are based on psychedelics. Does that kind of restrict our sense of what might be possible because we're anticipating that there will be resistance on the part of the people who are working within a comfortable with the medical framework to doing the additional therapeutic support, to understanding what that kind of personal internal experience might be like when somebody takes a psychedelic. And so is that driving the psychedelic industry to largely focus on the kinds of experiences that would fit better into the existing model, the contemporary model?
Scalable,
yeah,
easily commodifiable, minimally labor-intensive, minimally time-intensive interventions. That's the goal. And if they absolutely need some sort of therapeutic container, design some good VR goggles that will take care of them so that we can run more people at once. That's the thinking.
So I'm wondering, Jonathan, you actually just one quick thing. Jonathan, you mentioned on the phone earlier that you were paying attention to this new article written by folks at Compass about how they're approaching the therapy associated with their psilocybin-assisted therapy program that they're bringing through the FDA. And my understanding is essentially their intention was to scale back the commitment towards therapy, not even call it therapy, but to call it, I should remember this, but it's an assistance more than therapy. Supported. To say it's supported.
Psychological support.
Psychological support rather than the therapeutic practice kind of support, which would mean less therapist hours and would make it less expensive and would also make it more familiar for the way the FDA is used to analyzing and approving compounds. I'm just sort of wondering if this sort of how that plays with what we were just talking about.
I think there's two aspects of this. I mean, one is from a scientific point of view, and it's a very good article that Guy Goodwin wrote on this topic, but I'm sure it's probably going to ruffle a lot of feathers and the true believers that you have to do extensive psychological kind of psychological therapies. But I don't think that the jury's. I think what he's pointing out is that what exactly is helpful in terms of the psychological process before, during, and after some of these medicines are used is right now more a matter of belief than actual science. And I think the FDA, is always looming with all of these questions, and I think that's a big concern from the FDA. Is like, well, we don't really know what kind of therapeutic process is actually beneficial or helpful, or how helpful that is, and how to make sure that you're able to parse what is beneficial from the drug and what is beneficial from the therapy, and how those two are additive or synergistic or what have you. So I think that there's a tendency to want to be to be careful about in knowing that we know, thinking that we know more about exactly what that should be like. And I think that's where it'd be great if there was more research. There's starting to be more research dollars put into the science of this that allows you to start to evolve those sorts of process. But we're struggling with that as a small company, sort of in that way.
I would also just say I think it would be helpful if there were more dollars put into policy and drug education work, because as compelling as the research is that's happening right now, I think the right way forward is to allocate more resources and focus to that kind of work, because there are a lot of directions that the field can go in, and it's kind of an overwhelming moment and time because there's sort of a frenzy of energy right now in the field, and I think drug education is what is really going to be important for people going forward.
I'd just like to do a quick straw poll of you all, and just to get a sense of how many of you feel you've had a valuable therapeutic experience with psychedelics. I'd say it's a good number. Okay. And how many of you have actually had that experience with a therapist? A couple, 3 or 4. So I think that this comes back to exactly the question I think that you guys are raising, which is we can see efficacy with therapists. Clearly that is being shown in research, and that and many people will testify to that personally, anecdotally as well. But it's far from the only way that a therapeutic type experience can happen from people working with using psychedelics. Priscilla, you were mentioning Sasha and Shulgin before. They certainly did a lot of personal testing of the compounds that they created, and in fact, they had a whole social circle that would meet regularly to try new compounds. This went on for decades, and most of those people seem to be 98 years old right now and just fine, from what I can. And I'm wondering if we could maybe sort of think about how the personal experience that people might have with these compounds can help to inform the kinds of questions to explore in research as we begin to try to shape what might be efficacious, what kinds of compounds might be best to develop for medical purposes, but also what kind of questions to ask about psychedelics so we can understand them better. How important is the personal experience for a researcher?
Well, in terms of personal experience, I am probably less equipped to answer this question from a standpoint of whether it's necessary for a physician to have one, because I'm not a doctor. I would say no. I think it's necessary to be an empathetic and sensitive person, and to be aware of the complexities and challenges that come along with non-ordinary states of consciousness. And like Elias mentioned earlier, those aren't always drug-induced. I mean, that can be brought on by meditation or breathing or many other different things. So I don't think it's necessary for a researcher or a physician to have had psychedelic experiences with the drug. Yeah.
Jonathan, we were texting about that earlier today. When you sent me a page from the Mike J. Psychonauts book.
Yeah.
Do you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a. I mean, since the first explorations of, going back to things like, Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception with his mescaline experience, and sort of beginning to sort of see that these kinds of drugs can lead to experiences that are profound. There's been, and even before that with the nitrous oxide and ether and things like this. There's been a long tradition of the importance of self-experimentation, and I personally think that's like super valuable. I'm not saying that it's absolutely necessary for someone who's studying these things, that you can be an excellent scientist and do. We have scientists, say within Gilgamesh, who have never tried a psychedelic drug, and I'm almost 100% sure never will. But they're super helpful to the whole enterprise. But I think that having people in the scientific space who now can sort of bridge these two worlds, the world of where you're listening through the eyes of statistics and scientific reports and data, and also through the lens of your own experience, because I think that it helps to develop psychological theories and philosophical understandings, as well as I think generate a lot of sort of just I think tune people in who are into the space, who are doing the science. I think it's very useful personally, but I think I think to Priscilla's point, I don't think it's a requirement and to be a good scientist in the area.
I think in terms of moving the field towards a more neurophenomenological orientation, that's really interesting to me, because some of the more, don't get me wrong, I love the nitty-gritty, like chemistry, cellular, molecular stuff, but to an extent, because some of those questions sort of seem like beating a dead horse at a certain point. Like, I don't really know where they're going to get us. Like, some of the plasticity questions are interesting, but a lot of things induce plasticity. Exercise induces plasticity.
Can you just briefly explain what plasticity is?
Well, so structural plasticity would be, it can take a number of different forms, but
This is neuroplasticity, structurally
so the growth
in the
of
brain.
certain parts of neurons in your brain and new connections being made between neurons, which is a big endeavor in research. But my point is, I think, some of the experiences and the questions that have arisen from those experiences are important, because I would like to see things go in a more phenomenological way in terms of how research is being approached, in a little less reducing way.
Well, the idea of a psychonaut is interesting, and there is a danger to reifying a particular experience as psychedelic and identifying it as what these substances are supposed to be doing and how they do their work. And we've seen that to some extent with the ego dissolution craze that was going on for a while, where it seemed like that was the magic passageway towards wellness.
Are we over that?
It seems like it seems like we're now into more of a, I think we're having a mystical renaissance within the psychedelic renaissance. So the danger of thinking that the experience can be reduced to an experience, and losing sight of the relationality involved, the opportunity for lasting changes in how we engage with the world around us, with one another, those are not experiences, right? That's different mode that disclosed to experience, but it's beyond some restricted data point. So I think a point was brought up earlier about having a more ecumenical approach to these substances, or try.
Bring it a little closer.
Where we have a more ecumenical approach to these substances, where on the one hand, we're analyzing what they're doing neurobiologically. We're trying to develop new ones, and then that more kind of indigenous or mystical or sacramental perspective that Jonathan alluded to, which is, I think, rooted more in have respect and less about breadth, more about depth, less about teleology, more about being, not even about progress, really, just allowing ourselves to flourish with what we are. I'm not sure that those are reconcilable necessarily, and I worry about the extractive nature that comes with this zest to medicalize, and to presume we know what health means and what the secret to ascertaining clinical improvement is. I mean, I'm speaking as a scientist and a clinical trialist and a psychiatrist. I say that with full awareness of my involvement. But we do have to be very careful. And I think one of the challenges with these substances is that they do encourage us to draw a line in the sand in some ways.
So what I would wonder, though, were we to flip it around from what you just suggested, to consider, I think this is what's driving a lot of people's interest in this topic, that we could understand better aspects of consciousness, aspects of what it is to have a mystical insight or experience through our study of psychedelics, that it begins to uncover mechanisms that have been largely either never identified previously, or perhaps maybe ignored in certain ways, because as a society the West has tended in recent centuries to really not prioritize the mystical experience. And so many people who have them don't even recognize that they're having them. And so were the science to begin to support the existence of these mystical experiences, might that open the door to a shift?
But there's that, what does that even mean, science supporting the existence of mystical?
Supporting, they say, you can see there's certain things that happen
in the brain.
Yeah, or in the body.
What does that even mean? Like that we can reduce it to a neural correlate, that means it's true?
Yes. I mean, that would be the argument, right?
Yeah,
you hear this a lot,
you
right?
see how it invokes that same trope of materialist primacy, that because there's a neural correlate, then that means that the neural correlate is causing it, and that's what's true, and your experience is now valid. Whatever you're experiencing, okay, we now have the proof through our fMRI machine. That's a very dangerous way of thinking, and one of the reasons
So can I just ask, can you explain why you find that dangerous? What specifically is dangerous about it to you?
Well, we were just talking about how whole swaths of experience have been condemned as verboten because they don't, fit into our notion of what is real and true. And that stems from an invalidation of the subject, of subjectivity, of experience, that doesn't carry its own primacy, its own inherent value. So we want to be careful about trafficking in those toxic tropes.
I'm wondering if you see, I mean, because I'm assuming you have to address this in your own work, the way you address your own work, a path here between that concern about an overly materialist kind of analysis that segments and parses things in a way that seems on some level dangerous or inappropriate, and our ability to go further in a essentially materialist scientific understanding of the human body, and perhaps identifying aspects of consciousness through that practice that can help to open up our greater possibilities for that kind of mystical connection.
You clicked a little bit, maybe.
Well, I understand what you're saying. But I think my worry is that I don't think opening up, I don't know how you put it, greater consciousness into the mystical experience.
It's something like that. I don't remember what I said.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure the way towards that is through science and research and that kind of sort of reductionist, materialistic research. And that's not to say I feel dismissive of research and science, because I'm a scientist and there's a place for it. And like I mentioned earlier, I think that line of inquiry and curiosity is so important, and it has a place, but I don't think that's the way to open up more connection and relationship to mysticism.
I appreciate those words. I think the value of science is this opportunity to constantly be telling stories, imagining what's possible, being shown that what we thought was true isn't in fact true, continually, finding our way in the dark. It's a beautiful endeavor, and there's a lot of opportunity for humility and care and expanding our comprehension, how mysterious all this, our comprehension of our incomprehension. So in that regard, I think science can be a very useful practice, and it's one of my practices as the cup falls. But I am also wary of scientism and the rush to enshrine the findings of science as if they're absolute truth, and to give them a primacy that they don't deserve.
But I don't know, maybe we need, so I think that, like, if you're talking about, let's say, someone taking a anti-inflammatory drug for an autoimmune disease, I think that what really matters is the science, is understanding how that freaking drug is affecting T cell function and affecting, inflammation signaling that is causing, destruction of joints or fatigue or whatever that particular cadre of symptoms are. I think and I think that probably applies in, as well in neuroscience, and you're looking at a new antibody for treating Alzheimer's disease. You're looking at, like, so how the hell does this drug, work in order to protect cognition in people that are losing their ability to think? I think it's almost wholly a scientific endeavor and proposition, and much less a philosophical one. I think what's unique and different when we're talking about these sorts of drugs, and I think this is kind of what happened, is that historically was that, there were drugs, and the word drugs, started to take, over time started to take on a pejorative meaning. People are in the progressive era, whether that was alcohol or other opiates or whatever, it became like, oh, that person's on drugs, and this became their reality is being distorted or often disrupted, or they're it's almost like a level of illusion that was happening. And I think what happened with the psychedelics as being sort of unusual is starting with people like Huxley and others, is all of a sudden this realization that like you couldn't think about it anymore that way, that there was something rather philosophically and psychologically unique about these drugs, and that's important.
I did feedback.
We were getting a feedback, and so I just
Oh,
asked
yeah.
him to lift his mic up. But actually, so my question then is around this. In Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, he repeatedly refers to research results that suggest that when people have mystical experiences as part of their therapeutic practice with psychedelic-assisted therapy, their results are much more efficacious. And so what he draws attention to, and many people have said, because of that, largely because of his book, but certainly a big part of the conversation in this field, suggests that having strong mystical type experiences with psychedelics can actually be much more, can be an important part of addressing issues like depression or PTSD or many of the other kind of symptoms that are being
And
addressed.
maybe for some people in some circumstances, and probably not for everybody.
So understood.
Yeah.
But my question then is, how do you separate out, as Elias was suggesting, an analysis or a study of the physiological mechanisms from the mystical aspect of what also maybe is happening in parallel? To me, they seem so intertwined, and that it opened up this interesting possibility of understanding more about the mystical experience that would, in fact, it's a subjective perspective, but it would be valuable. It would be an interesting thing to do.
Maybe one analogy for this would be, that if you're talking about, say, a computer, you have hardware and software, and neither of them are exclusively important. And in this case, some of the experiences we're talking about that are elicited by these very novel, interesting drugs that everybody here is here because they're so fascinating. That psychological, those psychological processes are important, but there's also a way in which, these drugs are also, can be looked at in terms of kind of a, this neurocircuitry, neuroplasticity, fMRI machine, potentially way of looking at it, where you're looking at how, what's happening at the hardware level, and both are I think valid. Just like you'd be kind of curious if you talked about, you were a computer scientist and you were only interested in hardware and not software, or vice versa. That would be sort of odd.
I agree that a proper scientific and empirical approach would take into account all the possible ways that these substances and practices might be providing help. And it is just important to consider when we are talking about dissociating the experience from a neurobiological mechanism. Why are we asking that question? We're asking that question because it may provide benefit to people who otherwise cannot tolerate that. Great. I think that's, if we're asking that question because we want to do away with these effects and we regard them as invalid, which was the case at one point, and it seems like that's not so much the case anymore, though the FDA has its prejudices, then I think we should really think about what we're saying and consider challenging that prejudice directly.
The prejudice being
That the
Do away with the subjective.
that doing away with the subjective effect because it's problematic. inherently problematic.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure that.
You wouldn't say that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say
Some
that.
people- some people do.
Yeah,
And it is important.
I'm not even sure I hear people saying that. I think there are obviously for some individuals where, some of these effects could be detrimental or vulnerable individuals and such. So I think that could be the case. I hear more people, from a commercial point of view, interested in how to create drugs that are, going to be commercially and economically and productivity-wise, very attractive, and that's a business and financial point of view. But I think even those same people would or from the FDA's point of view, they're very risk averse, and they're always worried about, well, somebody's going to get taken advantage of, or something bad, someone's going to become psychotic, or what have you. But I don't hear people often saying that they're dismissing these deep, insightful experiences as being. They may not understand them, they may not have had them, but I think a lot of people have, and I think they value them. It's just more, I think, what your particular goal is in that respect.
It's easy, I think, to champion the deep, insightful experience. But what about when you feel like you're being punished by snakes, right? How do we make room for that in that?
I'm not sure I can wriggle out of that question.
So that there is a again, we want the soma type experience that is full of insight, bliss, and all of that. But sometimes these experiences go in infernal directions, and how do we make room for that? And how do we engage therapeutically with that? And how do we also create a framework where those kinds of experiences are recognized as part of the human continuum?
Can you answer?
No. I think that I think that it becomes. I think there's a variety of difficult experiences, right? And some of those difficult experiences may be something that that one can find ways to gather meaning out of, and to get some sort of therapeutic mileage out of. But there may be other circumstances where it's sort of like delirium, and if you give people enough say opiates or cocaine or all kinds of different things, you may have all kinds of experiences people have. Are they all therapy? Are they all something that is going to be therapeutically valuable? I doubt it. Are there difficult experiences with psychedelics that aren't useful? I'm sure there are. So I think I think it's a little hard to make everything into one sort of positive negative kind of algorithm.
I'm going to open this up to questions from the audience in just a moment, but before we do, I'm just wondering if each of you could quickly refer to some research result publication in the last year that really struck you as being particularly exciting and that people should know about, that maybe even helped to shape or change your understanding of the field. Because research is moving so quickly right now, there is a lot being published, and it's hard for people to keep up. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, have there been important breakthroughs in the last, let's just say, a year that you would like to bring attention to?
Anybody care to take that one?
That's a challenging question. I think because so often when a breakthrough or a big step is made, it's not due to one publication. It's due to many papers being published and many people trying to reproduce the result and asking the same question and addressing the same problem. And I think it depends what specific interest you're looking at. So I spent a lot of time in preclinical work. I'm trying to think. Within preclinical work, I know I'm a fan of Gould Dolan's work. She does a lot of work with critical learning periods because I think the translational validity of animal models sucks. But the work that she did is pretty promising, and I would like to see people reproduce those results.
So can you explain a little bit what critical learning period is?
Yeah, so a critical learning period, she worked with mice, and now I think is starting to do some work with octopi, which is pretty cool. I would like to see that, but
She's spiking them with psychedelics?
I don't know, I guess we'll see. But who knows? They have like the coolest nervous systems ever. Regardless, she was looking at the ability of classical psychedelics and some atypical molecules to open what's called a critical learning period within mouse models. And in the limited preclinical assays that do exist, that, like I said, kind of have no predictive validity, both learning tests and social tests are the ones that personally I think could be interesting and lead to some good results with drug discovery. So I've been paying attention to her work, and
So just to summarize, the use of a psychedelic could
Opens-
extend or
could
open.
reopen a critical learning period in a
Reopen.
mouse. So you would assume-
Related to social learning.
You would assume it would happen in a person as well, which might explain some of the mechanism behind being so suggestible when you're on psychedelics. And then Charles Nichols is doing a lot of work with anti-inflammatory effects. I keep an eye on that. Yeah.
That's to say, psychedelics can reduce inflammation?
Yeah.
Maybe.
That's the question. Yeah.
That's not so clear. I see a question from the audience from.
No, I just want to retouch upon the first article. I mean, and something that I thought was like really interesting about that one was just it was the tie to like what we describe as psychedelics, which is different than just classic psychedelics. So it's associated with MDMA, it was classic psychedelics, it was all of them, and it was also distinctive from drugs like cocaine and amphetamine, which people talk about neuroplasticity, and those drugs could induce neuroplasticity too, but they're not going to open that same critical pathway. So it was a cool link between all of those three, and then not connected to other drugs. And that's something that was
Yeah, I don't have a particular paper that jumps to mind as being like this is the most exciting thing. I just think there's been sort of a Priscilla's point. There's been like a whole kind of bunch of articles. For example, the MAPS work on MDMA and PTSD. The fact that there's large trials and larger if you just go back a few years ago, we were talking about very small studies that really were like interesting but like didn't really prove a whole lot, and now we're seeing with everything from psilocybin and MDMA, and now starting to be with other compounds where you're starting to see evidence that these drugs do have effects that are long lasting, and that that's the interesting concept of neuroplasticity, that these drugs are having efficacy beyond where the drug's no longer in your body, and these things are these effects are maintained, and you're having sort of those kinds of effects so I think it's just the whole field sort of moving ahead a bit, from the clinical viewpoint, and I earlier mentioned this whole area of non-psychedelic 2A agonists that where there's now multiple papers in high profile journals that are, you know, looking at that and exploring it. So we'll see where that all goes.
Also, just want to mention really quick, I think within the past year, maybe two, but Amy Hawk Newman, who's a very talented medicinal chemist, we read a paper, or reviewed a paper of hers in the lab on ibogaine analogs rescuing misfolded proteins, which is just remarkable, if true.
Can you explain why that's remarkable?
Remarkable because when you think of how many diseases are caused by misfolded proteins,
Sorry,
misfolded proteins,
misfolded proteins.
Parkinson's, Huntington's, a lot of different
Mad cow
things.
disease.
Well, yeah. But that's just awesome. I would like to see more about that.
Elias, nothing comes to mind?
It's just an embarrassment of riches.
We have another audience question. Boom and then boom. Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to ask more about Gilgamesh
Maybe-
research.
Maybe just come up and ask the question.
Yeah, I mean, Dillon's research, clearly really exciting. I mean, published in Nature, pretty impressive. Yeah, and I saw her, she talked about it last Horizons conference. She had sort of preliminary results then, and I found it really interesting. She said that, this was in an interview, that the length of the reopening of the critical period for social reward learning was proportionate to the length of the trip. So LSD opened the longest, and ibogaine the longest.
Take the mic.
And then, psilocybin much shorter. So this seems like really exciting research in terms of, especially what my question is, this is speculative at this point, but how might this research help us to understand how specifically things like childhood trauma are dealt with through psychedelic assisted psychotherapy? So for example, just something that pops to mind is the way that attachment styles are developed as in young children based on the way the caregiver interacts with them. And might there be a critical period there that closes that, if you have really abusive parents, then it's causing all these relationship problems later in life. And perhaps that's a critical period that could be reopened by psychedelics, and one could learn how to love and be loved differently. Obviously, I'm just speculating, but you guys have thoughts on that, or other ways that this could potentially go in terms of reopening critical periods?
I think that's an insightful conclusion to draw, that there's opportunity for not only a kind of default benefit, irrespective of any learning or work that's done, but that there's this opportunity for reworking things. And
Back in the early days of the psychedelic world, when Cary Grant was publicizing the value of psycholytic or therapy with LSD, with I forgot the name of this. What's that?
Cindy Cohn. Cindy Cohn was his therapist.
Was it Cindy Cohn? I couldn't remember. But I thought it was somebody else. But in any event, he described this as sort of, as sort of like a computer, where you're basically, just essentially, reformatting the hard drive, or and so.
Defragmenting the hard drive?
What's that?
Maybe defragmenting the hard drive?
These were early days of computers, so I don't think Cary really was an expert on that. But anyway, just the point being that it makes that same point. And I also hear people these days, who have, I don't think it's sort of like, and attachment styles and such are also somewhat probably not just environmentally determined, but genetically determined. And so I mean, I see a lot of people who are sort of, have children with, say, who are, sort of on the spectrum, which seems to be about 3/4 of the population, it seems. But who are, but where they're worried about their children who are, just having trouble with those sorts of, kind of social and emotional kind of learning processes. And so I think there's like there's this, I think the potential for these things to be thought of in that kind of neurodevelopmental kind of perspective. And maybe that's the same now with some of this sort of a recent paper in one of the Nature journals on eating anorexia nervosa, and showing that there were multiple individuals that it was found to be safe to give psychedelics to these patients, and that a large number of them sort of had a really profound experience that in some cases helped their symptomatology. So I think that may be another kind of example of a sort of neurodevelopmental process.
We have another question.
Thank you. With Oregon and Colorado beginning to regulate psilocybin therapy, in Colorado some other psychedelics in the next few years, I'm just curious to hear from each of you. What are your concerns and what are you going to be watching for?
I would just say, again, I would hope that efforts are made to increase drug education, awareness, and harm reduction. Yeah, I think that's really important.
So, Colorado still doesn't have its program off the ground, but Oregon had its first patient, or first client, I guess, receive psilocybin a few weeks ago. So it's now moving forward. And I was actually meeting with some of the people involved with Oregon's effort. And the challenges, I think, are what we would expect. The services are incredibly expensive. There's a long wait list of worried well waiting for psilocybin. There's very little effort to improve the infrastructure that leads to these kinds of iniquities, even in a very progressive place like most of Oregon. And so there's, I think a concern about haves and have-nots being able to access these things. The other challenge, of course, is that it's not a medical service, it's a wellness product that, like other modes of quackery, does offer opportunity for people to get help from medical or psychiatric issues. And there is the concern, especially as many of the people who are working don't have any healthcare backgrounds. In fact, it's problematic in Oregon for physicians to get involved because they're at risk of losing their licenses. That's changing in Colorado, but we basically have some people who are quite ill, in some cases, going to receive a very powerful substance from people who may not have the medical or psychiatric background to manage it appropriately. All of that being said, I think these substances should be legalized, and there should be more access to all substances without criminal issues, and that there should be education policy measures to both ensure that these substances are used responsibly and that they're not contaminated and accessed in ways that may create problems for people. But doing so, as is happening in Oregon, without giving more thought to these issues of equity and medical responsibility, I think we'll see what happens. But I am a bit concerned.
Jonathan, you wanna?
No, I have no comment on that.
Next question.
You've talked a lot about some of the questions we should be wary about, or in the whether it's on research, evolution, etc. I'm just curious for all of you who sound to have one feet in both worlds, and very involved in the medical system or the research system background, but also have shared some humble views on relationships with the substances. What questions do you think the field that should be asking overall for the future research on psychedelics?
Who would like to take that one first? What questions are not now being asked in the research that you feel could be asked or should be asked based on your insights through your own personal experience?
I'd like to see more research occurring side by side with some of the sacramental religious traditions and giving the same kind of rigorous attention that we're giving to clinical work to those practices. And doing so with mixed methods research to better understand what it is that we're working towards and how we might do so better, what kinds of modes of responsibility.
When you say research alongside spiritual practices or psycho-spiritual practices, that's just studying people who are having those experiences in various ways. What kind of questions would you ask? What would you focus in on? How would you have people in a ceremonial context do fMRIs? I mean, I'm curious if you want to sort of tease it out a little bit.
I think it's clear where I stand.
Yeah, but I'm just sort of thinking, well, what kind of, I'm just curious, like from a scientific perspective, what would one actually want to see studied in one way?
Well, one can begin by just having a more descriptive understanding. A lot is happening that we don't understand, and there are methods that one can bring to more granularly clarify what is the overall intention. What do people feel afterward? What is the structure of the setting?
So it sounds almost anthropological.
Yeah. In a way, yeah, mixed methods. You know.
Clifford Geertz,
Yeah, right.
thick description, as he called it.
And from there, you're getting clearer on, well, how can we tweak things, modify things in relationship with these practitioners? Is there something you'd like to try to see whether things might proceed differently and measure accordingly? It could be rich, and it's not something that's being done currently.
Priscilla?
I'm interested personally in, I would like to ask whether this kind of work with psychedelic substances has an effect on psychogenic symptoms that may be associated with different psychiatric conditions. And
Sorry, what's psychogenic?
symptom that may seem to have might present physiologically but have a psychogenic origin, so come from some psychological origin or emotional distress.
Hysterical blindness,
Well,
they used to call it.
yeah, that would be an antiquated way
Yeah,
to describe it.
but that's but I mean that's what people used to study back in the days. So now it's kind of the sort of psychosomatic medicine
Right.
space.
And in that same vein, because it seems like a lot of these experiences can help patients come into a more conscious and active role in their own healing, and those two things seem to be connected to me, so I think it'd be interesting to do a study on that.
Jonathan, is there one that something pops up to mind?
Do we have to sign an NDA first, Jonathan?
I'm kind of interested in I'd be very interested in sort of more research on some of the how to kind of best get the right sort of sensory inputs while people are on these drugs. You know, whether that's the kinds of soundscapes that are effective, and how you modulate those. Other just and other sort of sensory inputs, whether that's vision or somatosensory, you know, kind of vibration and other kinds of sensory inputs, but how to sort of combine these sorts of modalities, and then look at also just from the cognitive point of view on whether we can really use whether these drugs really sort of create a more rapid opportunity, a more rapid psychological therapy efficacy. So, you know, if you take things like cognitive behavioral therapy, you know, and people have had these sorts of drugs, can you essentially show that they are catalytic to that sort of therapy, and how that therapy should be designed to be most effective with these things, that as opposed to just the way that these therapies have organically grown, you know, outside of that. And that could be, you know, forms of CBT or meditation or other. I think there's a whole host of these things. So I think those sorts of areas, I think, are sort of really, it would be really interesting from an academic and, you know, practical point of view.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, we're getting, at some point we got to close this up, but I think we can do maybe 3 more, Kat, and then we can, does that seem good? Okay, let's start in the very back, and then we'll work our way up to you and you.
Hello. Well, my question was referring to the last question, because there is a surprisingly small amount of research considering the setting and in general the psychological aspect and the environmental aspect of people that were taking psychedelics and that got a therapeutic effect that wasn't in a controlled setting. So what is your general opinion on self-measurement reports, as in questionnaires that refer to a psychedelic experience, and mystical experience questionnaires that for a setting there aren't many standardized ones, but do you think that's even a valid way to go? Because that is a way that is not completely experimental. It is also a little pseudo-scientific. But if we collect more data on that, then we can get better data on it and gain a sort of a perspective about why do people take the same compound but can get completely different results, not only between people, but also one person can take a compound in one setting and get a therapeutic effect, and in another setting can get almost a dramatic effect. In general, what is your opinion on those types of measures?
Who would like to take that one? Maybe you can break it up into set and setting and understanding about set and setting, and then there's the variability of experience, which is perhaps related to set and setting, but
I mean,
we
the
don't
short
know.
answer is it's an important question, and we don't really know much. There's been research done starting in the 50s into what can shape an experience. The idea of, as Jonathan was saying, modulating various aspects of the setting would require a very huge N to really be able to ascertain what's going on. But it's a very important question. I wonder if either of you have any thoughts about.
Priscilla, did you have a thought?
Well, I would agree about the set and setting question being important. I just wanted to speak to something that you brought up, which was these like mystical experience questionnaires, and I don't know if you've heard of the like oceanic boundlessness questionnaire, which are interesting ideas, but I think the idea of trying to quantify an experience like that is kind of ridiculous. I mean, I don't know where that's supposed to take us to make data points out of like how mystical on an scale of 1 to 10 was your experience. But I do think the set and setting question is important, and I don't know, I would like to see more research on that, yeah.
I think quantifying ineffability seems kind of paradoxical to me. But I think it is an interesting question of how people can have, and I think Alexander Shulgin had described this. He had like this 0 to 4 scale that he would use to, what.
There was like a 4++.
It was like, it was just like 0, 1, 2, 3, and I think, and then people having these, very, peak experiences were the top one. But what he pointed out is that you could have these peak experiences from one experiment with the same drug to another, and that it wasn't the same in each case, and that's an unclear why that is, but it does sort of raise the issue of how a lot of psychological variables are priming people for that experience, and it's interesting that people realize, I think, that like psilocybin containing mushrooms are found throughout a lot of areas of the world. But in some places, they became sort of, in some ways, prosthetic gods. They became sort of, these sort of worshipped, the flesh of the gods, as it's known from the Aztec world, but in other places, where the same mushrooms were found, people started to have these experiences. They just thought they were being poisoned, and so there's a lot of context and that's important in how we understand these things, I'm sure.
You have another question?
As researchers and practitioners, how do you draw a line between psychological and like neurological disorders, and how are psychedelics kind of used in approaching treating different types of, because like in my mind a traumatic brain injury versus anxiety and depression feels very different, and like would psychedelics be able to be used in treatment of symptoms of more neurological disorders, and is there a line between psychological and neurological disorders?
Well, I think there are gross abnormalities that one can, of course, ascertain, and those are neurological disorders. The psychological can stem from clear neurological deficits and challenges, but in general, they have findings, neurobiological findings that are quite subtle and not by any consensus recognized as clearly etiologic. So that's, I think, the main distinction. All of that being said, there's clearly a lot of fuzziness that exists. I think that the mind and the brain are somehow intimately intertwined. Each affects the other. So if they even are separate. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying that just as a concrete example with ibogaine, the folks at Stanford, did a recent study where they looked at people with traumatic brain injury who were veterans and who had a lot of psychological symptomatology, like suicidality and such, and there's been, at least the data, it hasn't been, I'm not sure it's been published yet, but from the data that I saw, it was rather remarkable how efficacious the drug was on what would be considered a neurological process, and that. But I don't think we understand exactly what's going on there very well yet. But there was a lot of brain imaging going on in these studies. But just the symptomatology, subjective symptomatology, was remarkably improved. Based on these kinds of experiences with ibogaine in particular.
You have a question?
Well, I can project, so it's okay. My question was actually.
For the people like that.
My question was similar to the previous question, different effects, based on, with the same substance, but maybe I'll frame it differently. Have you had a bad trip? Or a really great one? I mean, in an homage to Sasha Shulgin. So if, as much as you would care to share, or if that's too personal, what precipitated your interest in the effects? And what's hopeful for you in it?
This is getting very personal.
I can just say on the last point. I was interested in this after sort of, being at university and ending up just sort of somewhat randomly being with some shaman in Gainesville, Florida, doing mushrooms, drinking mushroom tea, and that led me to become a psychiatrist. I remember it very vividly, and I remember exactly the steps that occurred right afterwards, and just how it sort of facilitated my sort of psychological self sort of exploration and philosophical kinds of thinkings about things that were somewhat affected in kind of a dramatic way, by that. I had to say it depends what you mean by bad trip, because I think the term is somewhat loaded. I've had sort of experiences that were difficult, but sometimes they were difficult in part of the experience, and then that seemed almost like a cathartic experience, so that the sort of the dark, you kind of almost like coming out of darkness into light kind of experience. So that's probably the closest to me. But I have to say that I just have one experience that makes me, I think, understand the concept of of what people mean by bad trip. But because I was doing mushrooms in sort of a with a lot of people, and I had to go to the bathroom, and so you had to walk out of this chamber where this sort of protected environment, and outside of it, where the bathroom was, you could hear the bar in Brooklyn downstairs at 2 a.m, and it sounded like the voices of the damned.
Anybody else want to jump on that? Thank you all for coming out tonight. I want to thank our panelists, Elias, Priscilla, and Jonathan. And we look forward to seeing you again here. I want to thank the Psychedelic Athenaeum for hosting this tonight. And come on back for more.